Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal in the dim recesses of a heavily guarded medical compound nestled on a remote island far from any known coordinates, Britt moved like a shadow through sterile corridors lined with unblinking surveillance. Each night, as if governed by a ritual more sacred than habit, she retrieved a vial of opaque, unmarked serum from a refrigerated cabinet secured behind biometric locks. The liquid shimmered faintly under the cold glow of overhead fluorescent lights. Her salvation and her sentence, drawn up into a syringe with the same precision a soldier might clean a weapon before battle. With practiced ease, she injected it into her arm, barely flinching, her eyes dull from repetition but her mind never truly numb. She lay back on the clinical, unwelcoming bed, its surface colder than steel and just as unforgiving, staring at the ceiling as the serum coursed through her veins like silent fire. This nightly act was not born from routine, nor from desperation, but from a non-negotiable contract unspoken and unsigned, binding her to unseen forces whose names were never uttered, whose faces she had never seen. She had once been a doctor, a daughter, a woman who stood under the spotlight of the nurse's ball with a biting smile and secrets hidden behind her eyes. Now, she was a pawn cloaked in clinical white, her identity reduced to a number in a locked drawer. The disease that had once stalked her future with certainty, Huntington's, had not vanished, but been tamed. Not cured, not removed, only silenced by a drug so experimental, so closely guarded, that even the world's most elite research hospitals had only heard rumors of its existence. Her access to that miracle was no act of mercy. It was leverage. The cost for each injection was obedience. Compliance. Absolute silence. The cure was given not with compassion but with calculation, a leash disguised as a lifeline, administered nightly to remind her what she stood to lose. Should she resist, delay, or disobey even a single instruction, the supply would cease. And with it, so would her future. But this was not a copy. This was not a clone. This was not a hologram of the woman Port Charles had lost. This was Britt herself. Fully aware, fully conscious, and fully shackled to a mission she had never agreed to but could not escape. She had been absorbed into a secret project, one whose scope and implications stretched beyond anything she could fully comprehend. The scientists around her rarely spoke to her directly, and those who did carried rehearsed lines and mechanical smiles. The one who issued the orders, the man whose presence lingered like a phantom in every decision, remained invisible. He was never named, but the mere suggestion of his involvement had made even the calculating Sidwell and the imperious Dalton defer in quiet dread. Britt felt the weight of his unseen eyes more than any camera, his directives more binding than any law. Back in Port Charles, Liesl's heart continued to beat in time with the unknown. She didn't know where her daughter had gone, but she felt it, felt her presence suspended somewhere between danger and survival. Often she would sit alone deep into the night, poring over medical records that had long since grown cold, chasing patterns that didn't quite exist, clinging to the subtle hope that Britt was still out there, still fighting, still herself. And though Britt's whispered goodnights to mutter never traveled across the sea, they lived in the static of the world between dreams and grief, echoing inside a mother's instinct that refused to fade. Inside the compound, Britt lived as both tool and prisoner. Her every movement was monitored. Her thoughts were anticipated. Her memories were analyzed for emotional weaknesses. No communication was allowed. Even the subtlest attempt to send a message to the outside world would be caught, punished, and likely lead to her removal from the program, permanently. But even the most rigid regimes underestimate the resilience of memory. One night, when the staff changed rotations and the cameras briefly cycled through a reboot, Britt took a risk. She opened an encrypted browser built into a forgotten maintenance console and searched for Nurse's Ball. She didn't click anything. She didn't dare. But seeing the images, flashes of smiles, of Elizabeth in her elegant dress, of Scott awkwardly laughing, of her mother in that crimson gown, ignited something in her. A reminder. A heartbeat. It wasn't longing. It was resistance. The mistake, if it had been one, was not immediately punished. But Britt knew better. In this place, consequences did not arrive with fanfare. They arrived as silence. A technician who failed to respond to protocol no longer showed up the next day. A nurse who smiled too often was replaced by one who didn't. A doctor who once confided in Britt was reassigned after whispering, "If you stop complying, they'll just replace you. They already have backups." The implication lingered like poison. What if her DNA, her memories, even her essence had been digitized and stored? What if somewhere in the depths of this program, another Britt was being readied, loyal, unquestioning, empty of rebellion? She began to notice subtle changes. The serum vials were labeled differently, marked with codes she could no longer decipher. Her daily tasks were no longer medical in nature, but computational, sequences, simulations, predictive behavior analysis. She realized she was no longer being treated like a patient or an employee, but like an interface, something between machine and human, valued only for her biological responses. Her handwriting was scanned. Her dreams were logged. The music she hummed under her breath was recorded and categorized. The serum, she feared, was not only treating her disease but altering her mind. But Britt would not break. She began to leave subtle marks in places no one checked. Under drawer linings, inside discarded gloves, beneath loose tiles. Each one held a symbol only Liesel would recognize, a callback to a childhood lullaby, a coded plea only a mother would understand. She knew she might never escape, but someone needed to know. Someone had to be warned. The world believed she had vanished. Port Charles had moved on. But if her voice could travel through the labyrinth of cold metal and encryption, if it could somehow find its way back, then maybe this wasn't the end. In the moments before sleep, with the drug whispering through her bloodstream and the lights dimming to artificial night, Britt imagined Port Charles not as a place, but as a promise. She clung to it the way drowning men cling to driftwood, not for rescue, but for defiance. Because even if she died here, even if her story never reached anyone, she would die knowing she had resisted. She would die human. And if there was any justice left in the universe, the ones controlling her now, the ones who used sickness as a leash and memory as a weapon, would one day face the truth she had buried like seeds beneath the sterile floors of their perfect prison. The writers of General Hospital are no longer sidestepping the reality of Huntington's disease. In a medium often accused of relying on implausible miracles and forgotten plotlines, they've made a deliberate and haunting decision to embrace the full weight of Britt's diagnosis. They haven't asked the audience to believe that she miraculously recovered, nor have they attempted to write off her condition with a convenient cure. Instead, they've transformed Huntington's into a living tether, a chain that binds Britt to a world more twisted and dangerous than anything she has ever known. It is not just a personal illness, but a narrative weapon, used to force her into submission and compliance, to keep her tethered to a shadowy system she no longer understands, let alone controls. This isn't simply a medical arc. This is the foundation of a far-reaching conspiracy, one that stretches well beyond the confines of any hospital or underground lab. Behind the scenes of Britt's daily injections and clinical routines, a sinister architecture has taken shape. The audience is slowly being drawn into a larger mystery, and at its center lies a question that grows darker with every passing episode: what is the true purpose of the project that holds Britt captive? Is it the development of a genuine cure for Huntington's, kept secret and weaponized by the powerful? Is it the fabrication of biological weapons disguised as humanitarian breakthroughs? Or is it something even more insidious? A manipulation of the human mind itself, sold to the world under the guise of scientific advancement. It was in a moment of physical weakness, brought on by a particularly severe reaction to the nightly serum, that Britt stumbled upon a truth more terrifying than the disease that plagued her. Her hands trembling, her vision blurred, she had collapsed against a sterile wall of the observation unit. A low-level researcher, perhaps the only remaining staff member with a shred of compassion, had broken protocol in a whisper. "If you stop," he murmured, eyes flickering toward the surveillance cameras, "we already have a backup." Then, as if those words had marked his fate, he was gone the next day, transferred, reassigned, or perhaps erased entirely. His warning, however, remained, echoing in Britt's mind like a drumbeat of impending doom. She couldn't shake it. What did he mean by backup? Was there another version of her being grown somewhere in that facility, its DNA identical, its memories uploaded, its compliance pre-programmed? Had her thoughts, her fears, her very essence already been replicated under the guise of research? Had she, without realizing it, signed away her autonomy the moment she agreed to be treated? Suddenly, the concept of self became unstable. Was she still Britt, or had she already been overwritten in some subtle, imperceptible way? The dread deepened as she began noticing subtle but undeniable changes in the people around her. The faces she had grown used to, technicians, security guards, researchers, started disappearing, replaced by strangers who rarely spoke and never made eye contact. Those who remained became distant, robotic, stripped of the casual camaraderie that had once made the sterile corridors slightly more bearable. Even the tone of daily briefings had shifted. They no longer discussed treatments or data trends but instead focused on operational consistency, protocol adherence, and containment metrics. The language had changed, and with it, the purpose. Her tasks, once framed as collaborative contributions to an experimental cure, had become more abstract. The vials she analyzed no longer matched the molecular profiles of anything she had studied in medical school. The test subjects, once described vaguely as clinical trial participants, were now completely unseen. She was handed results to evaluate, data to categorize, blood samples to assess, but she never saw the patients herself. That was the first sign. The second was even more disturbing. One morning, a sample labeled simply as BW variant 3 landed on her workstation. The initials jolted her like a thunderclap. The sequence was almost identical to her own, too similar to be coincidence, but with key differences in neural markers and behavioral gene expressions. Was this a synthetic derivative of her genome? A test subject engineered from her biological blueprint? The realization struck her with such force she nearly dropped the data pad. If this variant was real, then she wasn't just a patient or employee. She was the prototype. Britt's world narrowed. Every hallway, every locked door, every unreadable code became a potential gateway into some twisted extension of herself. If the serum had side effects before, they now took on sinister new significance. Was her memory faltering naturally, or was it being chemically suppressed? Were her dreams her own, or simulations being tested for stability? Each thought spiraled, and yet she could never show it. Surveillance was omnipresent. Micro-expressions were tracked. She knew full well the moment she hesitated, the moment she slipped, they'd activate the contingency plan, the backup. Worse still were the glimpses she caught through lab windows at odd hours, never meant for her, never acknowledged. Subjects in isolation units whose movements were sluggish, whose eyes darted in vacant patterns, whose hands sometimes twitched in the same rhythm she had seen in herself during episodes of Huntington tremors. Were they failed versions of her? Other women whose lives had been erased so that they could become someone else's experiment? And yet she continued the work, because she had no other choice. She was not free. She was not even safe. If she stopped, she would die, not of her illness, but by design. And even in death, she would not be free, because the project would continue. Her likeness, her DNA, her medical data, everything had already been absorbed into the system. She was no longer a person but a property, dissected and replicated in pursuit of a goal so obscure that even those administering it might not fully understand. She could not flee. She could not resist openly. But she could remember. And she could record. Hidden in the margins of test logs, encoded in chemical shorthand, she began leaving fragments, warnings, questions, signatures of defiance. She embedded them into the metadata of files she was told to transmit, masked as benign anomalies. She left messages in equations, symbols in unused variables, scratches beneath the lenses of her lab goggles. Somewhere, someone had to see them. Somewhere, someone might ask why one particular patient's genome kept reappearing across multiple projects. Why one subject's reaction times were logged under different initials. Why the letters BW kept haunting the data like a ghost refusing to vanish. As the days passed and the serum's hold on her deepened, Britt vowed that if she had to disappear, if she was ever replaced, silenced, overwritten, then she would not go quietly. She would leave behind a trail. She would inject the truth into the very code of the conspiracy that trapped her. And when the day came that someone finally uncovered it, when Port Charles or someone far beyond its borders traced the signal back to this forgotten island, they would know that she had fought. That she had been real. That she had mattered. And that those who controlled her had made the mistake of underestimating Britt Westbourne. In a moment of reckless courage, one born not of madness but of the need to reclaim even a sliver of autonomy, Britt etched a tiny symbol on the underside of the glass syringe she used every night. It was so faint, so delicately carved, that it could have easily gone unnoticed by anyone else. But it wasn't meant for just anyone. The symbol, a crescent enclosed in two overlapping triangles, was known only to one other person in the world, Liesel. It was a code they had used long ago, something they had once scrawled in the margins of textbooks during Britt's med school years, a secret language between mother and daughter. To anyone else, it would appear as a meaningless mark, perhaps a manufacturer's defect or a scratch from wear. But to Liesel, it would scream. It would whisper everything Britt could not say aloud. A silent cry for help, an encoded affirmation that she was still alive, still resisting, still herself. It was all she could do. There were no letters, no messages, no phones, no outgoing signals in the compound. Everything was scrubbed clean. Her only hope was that the syringe, if it were ever returned to the outside world through waste, supply rotation, or theft, might pass through someone's hands. That someone might notice the mark. That Liesel, in her relentless, obsessive search for her daughter, might recognize it. It was hope measured in probabilities so small they bordered on fantasy, but in a place where identity had been systematically dismantled, even a fantasy was rebellion. Yet as the days passed, that sliver of hope felt increasingly brittle. Outside the compound, Britt's name had begun to vanish. Port Charles moved on, its heartbeat pulsing with new scandals, new romances, and new tragedies. Time marched forward in the way that small towns always do, relentlessly, indifferently. Britt Westbourne had been mourned, remembered, and ultimately archived, a tragic footnote in the ever-evolving history of the town. Liesel, though consumed by the void left behind, had no solid clues. Without evidence, without a body, even her fierce maternal instincts were brushed aside as denial by those around her. And so the world turned without Britt, her name slowly dissolving into the past, her face fading from the collective memory of the place she once called home. Inside the compound, as she lay strapped to another cold table, her pulse monitored, her brainwaves logged, Britt felt the ache of being forgotten. But she refused to be erased entirely. As the red light at the end of the corridor began to blink, a signal they all understood by now, a chilling herald of another round of experimentation. She inhaled sharply and exhaled slowly, steel rising behind her eyelids. The needle was readied. The syringe clicked into place. The cold burn of the serum slid into her bloodstream like ice through veins, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. Not anymore. She welcomed the chill. She welcomed the firestorm it might bring. Because something had shifted inside her. It wasn't just resistance anymore. It wasn't just desperation. It was purpose. A quiet fury, steady and focused, now fueled her every movement. They thought they had broken her. They thought the threat of disease or replacement would keep her pliant forever. But Britt had realized something even more terrifying than death, the loss of truth. And she would not let that go unanswered. If she were to die here, replaced, discarded, rendered obsolete, then she would ensure that her truth lived longer than she did. She would sew it into the very algorithm she was ordered to run, embed it in molecular code she was told to sequence, distort their data in ways so subtle only a brilliant eye like Liesl's could decode it. She would turn every task into sabotage, every experiment into confession. Her hands, though outwardly compliant, would write the first chapters of an exposé so damning it would shatter the illusion of benevolence surrounding the program. The same serum they used to control her would become the vehicle through which she unraveled them. Even if Port Charles never saw her again, even if the town never remembered her name, Britt would make sure that somewhere, somehow, someone would know. Know that she existed. That she resisted. That the horror she endured had a face, a voice, and a heart that never gave in. And so, under the dim light of that sterile chamber, as the machines hummed and the shadows shifted behind soundproof glass, Britt did the only thing she could: she survived. Not just in flesh, but in spirit. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She let the needle plunge and the cold take her, and in that silence, in that stillness, she made a vow. If she must live under the control of monsters, she would become their undoing. If she must die in their custody, she would die with her truth inscribed in every line of corrupted code she touched. And if the world ever dared to forget her, she would find a way to remind it. Because Britt Westbourne was not just a patient. Not just a daughter. Not just a ghost. She was the fuse, burning quietly in the dark, waiting for the moment the spark would reach the powder. And when it did, everything they built would come crashing down.